B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Shkalim Daf Yud. We're going to start from the next Perek Dalud, at the bottom of Daf Tes Amud Beis. Says the Mishnah, until now we've learned that they would bring Shkalim, Machzis HaShekels, every year to this chamber called the Lishka of the Shkalim, and then they would do a Trumas HaLishka. They would 3 times a year, they would withdraw money from this chamber into 3 boxes, and that would be the Trumas HaLishka. Says the Mishnah, HaTruma, this Trumas HaLishka, what would they do with it? Maho yu'osin ba. What were they supposed to use the money of these 3 boxes that were removed 3 times a year from this chamber? What do you do with that money? Later on in the parak we'll learn what they would do with the remaining coins in the chamber, and what they would do with the remaining coins in these boxes when they would finish and withdraw more money into the boxes. But now we're asking the most basic and straightforward question: what was the Trumas HaLishka used for? Says the Mishnah, we would use it for all the korbanos tzibur. The classic ones are Tmidim, the twice daily korban tomid, or Musafin, the korban tomid, the korban musaf that was brought on Shabbos, on Rosh Chodesh, on Yom Tov. V'niskem, they would be brought with nesachim, with wine, and with flour, and with oil, and whatever was accompanied the korbanos. Ha'omer, the mincha that was brought on the 16th of Nisan, on the 2nd day of Pesach, the korban omer. Ushtei alechem, there was a mincha that was brought on Shavuos, the 2 breads. V'lechem aponim, every week they would bring the 12 breads, the lechem aponim. V'chol korbanos hatzibur, and any and all other korbanos tzibur. Continues the Mishnah, Shoimrei sfichin b'shvius. Now on Shvius, one's not allowed to, all the vegetation, all fruits, vegetables, all the grains, they're all hefka. But they needed to cut some of the produce of Shemitah for the Omer, for the Shtei Alechem, and the Sfichin are what would grow without planting. You're not allowed to plant in Shemitah. But some of the offshoots of what was still growing in the 6th year would produce some plantation in the Shemitah year. And in order that people shouldn't take it, and then there would be no produce left to be used for the Omer, then they would have these guards, these Shomrei Sfichin B'Shvius, and they would guard them in order that the Beis HaMikdash can use them for these menachos that needed to be used, and to be used with the Tvua of that year. So these people who were guarding the Sfichin of Shvius, they would have to get paid wages. So Noitlin Scharon Mitrumas HaLishka, they would also be paid their wages from this Trumas HaLishka. Rabbi Yossi says, Af haroitza misnadev shemer chinam. Rabbi Yossi says that even if a private individual person chose to volunteer to guard these Sfichin and not to be given a wage for it, we allow him to do that. Omruloi, so the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yossi, Af ata omer she'ein boin elo mishal tzibur. Do you not agree that the korban omer has to be brought from produce that belongs to the tzibur? It's a korban tzibur. And if a private person is going to guard it, then even though the Shemitah in and of its own, the produce is hefker, is ownerless, this person who's guarding it will that way be koine it, and then he's going to be donating, so to speak, this tvur that he's guarded, donating it to the Beis HaMikdash. Do we allow a yochid, a private person, to donate something for a korban tzibur? They said to Rabbi Yossi, we don't allow that. Rabbi Yossi obviously held that if this private person, it's true that he will acquire this produce, but if he's then with a full heart going to give the produce to the Beis HaMikdash, it's not called a korban yochid, it's called a korban tzibur, and that suffices. It means the Chachomim held that ein korban yochid mishtane l'shel tzibur, and Rabbi Yossi held that it was okay, and korban yochid mishtane l'shel tzibur. We'll see more about this in the Gemara. Says the Gemara at the top of Daf Yud Amud Aleph. Tman Taninon, we learned in the Mishnah, and as I've mentioned a few times, we're going to read the Gemara according to the Girsa of the Vilna Gaon and according to the explanation of his Talmud, the Takrin Chadetin. Tamon Taninon, we learned in the Mishnah, Zman Atzei Koyanim, and this is a sugya in Masechet Tainis, that there were times, 9 times a year, where people would come private people, kohanim, together with other people in the nation, that they would have their time where they would donate woods for the Mizbeach. So there's man atze kohanim va'am lihimonos. There were these 9 times where these private people, that would be their day to donate the woods for the Mizbeach. Elo b'shah she'olu Yisrael min ha'goyla. That when Klal Yisrael, after the 70 years in Golus Bavel, Klal Yisrael came up from the exile, and they realized that in the chamber of the woods there was not enough woods for the Mizbeach. And these 9 families, these 9 groups, they stood up, and from their own private woods they would donate to the Beis HaMikdash, and they would give it over to the Tzibur, even though the korbanot tzibur may only be burnt on woods that belong to the tzibur. Here we see clearly that there were private people who would donate woods, and they would be mosrum letzibur. They would give it over with whole heart to the tzibur, to the public. V'korvu mehem korbanot tzibur, and they would use these woods to burn the korban tzibur, or the communal korbanos, on these woods. V'hisnu imoem neviim shebeneim, and the neviim of that generation, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Ezra, Nehemiah, shafilu lishka meleo eitzim. Even in the event that in later years there would be a chamber full of woods belonging to the tzibur, v'omdu elu, and these 9 groups come on the designated dates, v'nisnat v'eitzim mishel atzmon, and they come and donate woods on their own accord, shlo yehi korban miskariv elo mishalehem tchila, then they would first bring the korbanos on those woods that were dedicated. Only after those woods were finished would they use the woods in the chamber. So what do we see from here? Well, we'll soon see what we see from here, but in this Mishnah it's clear that there were the Yechidim, the private people, would donate woods for the Mizbeach to be used as a korban tzibur. The question is this Mishnah taking a side with the machlekes we learnt in our Mishnah? In our Mishnah we said that Rabbi said that a private person can volunteer to guard the tevuah, which would then have to be used as a korban tzibur, the korban omer, and he would not get paid wages by the tzibur. And the Chachamim say no. The Chachamim say that even before you acquire the tevuah, we're going to pay you, Hekdesh are going to pay you, and they would use the Trumas Halishka for this. They would pay these workers in order that the workers, they will not acquire it themselves, they would be just simply employed by Hekdesh to guard them, and it will be Hekdesh that is acquiring the tevuah. And according to the Chachomim, it has to be Hekdesh, that tevuah belonging to Hekdesh, not tevuah belonging to a private person who would then donate it to Hekdesh. Well, how does the opinion of Rabbi Yossi conform with this Mishnah in Tainis? And that's actually going to be Machlekes. Omer Rav Acha. Rav Acha maintained, Rabbi Yossi, that this Mishnah in Tainis indeed is only according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. According to the Chachomim, however, these private people, we would not use the woods of private people for the public korbanos. Rabbi Yossi, because it was Rabbi Yossi who said, as we saw in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi says we have no issue, and we trust that if a single person gives over his donation to the Beis HaMikdash, he's giving it over with a full heart, and it becomes belonging to the community, to the tzibur. However, Rabbi Yossi, b'shem Reb Ila, this is an Amira, he argued with Reb Acha, and he said that Divrei HaKoilchi, it could be that even the Chachomim in our Mishnah, who say that the tevuah, the grains of the omer, must not come from a Yachid, will agree that the woods of the Mizbeach can come from a Yachid. Why? He says Divrei HaKoilchi. Ma Peleginon, when is there machlokes in our Mishnah? Only begufo shel korban, in the essence of the korban itself, namely the grains that are going to constitute the korban omer. However, aval b'machshiri korban, for those things that are just needed in order to improve or in order to allow the korban to be brought, but isn't the essence of the korban, kol alma moida, everybody agrees, even the Chachomim in our Mishnah will agree, shehu mishtane korban yochid le korban tzibur, that a private person can give the woods and turn it into a tzibur, into the belonging of the tzibur for a korban tzibur. On a similar note, says the Gemara, Tani, we learnt in another Mishnah, Isha she'osasok soines lebana. If you have this mother whose son was a Kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Kohen had to wear big day kahuna. The Kohen Gadol had 8 garments, the regular Kohen had 4 garments, and these garments had to be brought from the tzibur. And here you've got this mother who wanted to sew for her son the big day kahuna. Then kashera, she's allowed to do that. She sews it for him, she gives it over to the tzibur, and her son will wear it. So it says in the Mishnah it's kosher, ubilvad, on condition shetimseren al tzibur, that she wholeheartedly gives it over to the tzibur. So Omar Rabbi Acha, again Rabbi Acha says Rabbi Yossi that Mishnah conforms only with Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi Omer af haroitza misnadiv shemer chinam, that a private person can volunteer to guard those sfichin, the tvua, which was going to become the korban omer, and then give it to the tzibur. And therefore he says the same applies with the big day kahuna. Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Ila. However, Rabbi Yossi the Amoira argues and says divrei hakril. Again, he says the same as we said before. It could be that even according to the Chachomim in our Mishnah that do not allow private people to guard the sfichin will agree regarding big day kahuna that it's okay. Ma peleginon. When are they arguing in our Mishnah? Begufei shel korban, only with the essence of the korban itself, the produce that was going to make the korban omer. Avol b'machshirei korban, but something that is just needed and aiding the korban. For example, the big day kahuna, kul al mamoida. All opinions, even the chachomim in our Mishnah will agree. Shehu mishtane korban yochid le korban tzibur, that we trust and we allow a single individual to give over the big day kahuna to the tzibur, and it becomes to the tzibur. Continues the next Gemara. Masnisin pliga al Rabbi Acha. It seems that we're going to have from the following Mishnah, there's going to be a proof against Rabbi Acha. What did Rabbi Acha just say? Rabbi Acha said that just in the same way as in our Mishnah, it's Rabbi Yossi who says that af haroitza misnadiv shemer chinam, so too only according to Rabbi Yossi can a private person bring woods for the mizbeach, and only according to Rabbi Yossi can a private person donate the big day kahuna for the kohanim. That's what Rav Acha maintained, and we're going to now see from the following Mishnah it would seem a contradiction to Rav Acha. Because what does it say? The Oyson Yomim, those days that coming back to the 9 families or 9 groups of people that would bring the woods to the mizbeach, that according to the Tanakh, according to the Chachomim, noyagin b'shas korban, it would be a yom tov for them on the day that they would bring this korban. Namely, they would bring a korban together with the woods they were bringing, which means in the time that the Beis Hamikdash existed, and on those dates they would bring wood and bring a korban, it would be a yom tov for them. V'shalei b'shas korban, and even when there was no Beis Hamikdash and they wouldn't bring a korban, it would remain and still be a yom tov for them, according to the Tanakh. Rabbi Yossi argues and says, Einon noyagin elo b'shas korban bilvad. Rabbi Yossi says, no, only when there was a Beis Hamikdash and they would actually bring the woods and bring a korban, that's when it would be a yom tov for them. However, in the time after the Beis Hamikdash, when they would not bring the woods, there's no Beis Hamikdash, they don't donate any woods, there's no korban, so there's no yom tov. Omer Rabbi Elazar Bei Reb Tzadok. Rabbi Elazar Bei Reb Tzadok said, and they were following the opinion of the Chachomim, not Rabbi Yossi. They said, Onu ayinu mibnei Sono ben Binyamin. We belong to that family of Sono ben Binyamin, and our day, that was the date that was designated to us, the day we brought the woods, was on the 10th of Av, the day after Tisha B'Av. And let's remember, Tisha B'Av was only ever practiced after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, not when the Beis Hamikdash was standing. V'chal Tisha B'Av li'etz b'Shabbos. 1 year Tisha B'Av was on Shabbos. You don't fast on Shabbos. They would push off the fast to the next day, to Sunday. But Sunday was the 10th of Av, which is their Yom Tov. V'dochinu oisei l'motzei Shabbos. We pushed off Tisha B'Av to Motzei Shabbos. V'yinu mis'anim. We would fast. V'lei mashlimen. We would make sure not to fast until the end of the day, because it was our Yom Tov. So what do we see from here? We see clearly that even according to the Chachomim, those dates remained a Yom Tov for the people, for these Yechidim that were bringing the woods. And this seems to be contrary to what Rabbi Acha said before. Rabbi Acha said before that whole Mishnah in Tainis that speaks about the Yom Tov of the Yechidim only follows Rabbi Yossi. But according to the Chachomim don't allow private people to bring woods for the Mizbeach. So according to Rabbi Acha's understanding of the Chachomim, then why were these private people, why was Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok saying that we come from the family of Sono ben Binyamin and we had a Yom Tov? Why do you have a Yom Tov? According to Rabbi Acha. According to Rabbi Yossi, the Amoira who said that everybody, even the Chachomim of our Mishnah, agree that the issue is only with the atzmei shel korban, only the produce of the korban omer itself. But with the woods, as with the big day kahuna, we don't have a problem. Then it's okay. That's why the Yechidim had a Yom Tov. But according to Rabbi Acha, who says that it's only Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah who holds that way, not the Chachomim, then why did these people have a Yom Tov even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed? They kept this date as if they all, right through the generations, they always continued giving on that date. They continued bringing the woods to the Beis Hamikdash. According to the Chachomim, Rabbi Acha says they were not allowed to do that. They didn't do that. And this is a question which the Yerushalmi asks against Rabbi Acha. Continues the Gemara. Tamon Toninon. We learned in a Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Menachos. Kol korbanos hayochid va'atzibur, any korbanos, private korbanos, or the public korbanos, the communal korbanos, boin min ha'oretz, they can be used either from produce from Eretz Yisrael, umin chutz la'oretz, or from chutz la'oretz, min ha'chodosh, from that year's produce, umin ha'yashon, and from a previous year's produce. Chutz min ha'omer u'shtei alechem, besides for the korban omer on the 16th of Nisan, and the shtei alechem on Shavuos, she'ein boin elo min ha'chodosh, they have to be brought from the new produce of that year, umin ha'oretz, and they have to be brought from Eretz Yisrael. Reb Chuna b'shem Reb Yirmiyah, so Reb Chuna b'shem Reb Yirmiyah maintains, Rabbi Shmuel that Mishnah that says that the korban omer and the shtei alechem have to come only from fruits from produce of Eretz Yisrael and only from the chodosh, it must follow the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel omer. Rabbi Shmuel is the one that holds that ein ha'omer ba, the produce used, the grains used for the korban omer, do not come even min Syria, from Syria, which had partial halachas of chutz la'aretz because David HaMelech captured Syria. It's a discussion in other places in Shas. It had some halachas of chutz la'aretz, and nonetheless, Rabbi Shmuel said, even though it's partially had halachas of Eretz Yisrael, you could not use it for the korban omer. Even more so, chutz la'aretz proper, you could not use for the korban omer. So when it says in this Mishnah, then Menachos, that the korban omer and the korban shtei alechem have to come from min ha'oretz, from Eretz Yisrael, says Rav Chuna b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, it's following this opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Continues the Gemara. Tamon Taninon. We learnt a Mishnah in Kalim. Eser Kedusha Yisein. There were 10 levels of Kedusha. Eretz Yisrael Mukudeshes Mikol Ha'arotzis. Of all the lands in the world, Eretz Yisrael is the most Kodesh. Umay Kedusha Asa. What that halachic ramifications of the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael? Shemavien mimenu ha'omer va'bikurim u'shtei alechem. That the omer, the bikurim, which was of the Shivas Haminim, the 7 species, the first of each of those fruits that ripened would be brought as bikurim to the Beis Hamikdash, u'shtei alechem, masha'ein mevien came min ha'arotzis. That it says in that Mishnah, it's only brought from Eretz Yisrael, not from the other lands, and that's the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And again, Rabbi b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Shmuel, it's following the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel Omar, ein ha'omer ba min Asuria. Rabbi Shmuel holds that you cannot bring even the wheat. The omer is not from wheat; it's from barley. That was the omer. The shtei alechem is brought from wheat, but they have to be brought from Eretz Yisrael, and even from Syria, which has partial halachas of Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to bring it. And kol shekain chutz la'aretz. Ditnan. Where did we learn that Rabbi Shmuel himself holds that ein ha'omer ba min Asuria? We've mentioned it twice already. What's the source? Ditnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Shmuel omer ma chorish reshus af kotzir reshus. That in Shabbos, when the pasuk says that you're not allowed to do charish, you're not allowed to plow, and you're not allowed to do ktsira, you're not allowed to cut the produce. And the Torah compares the two. In the same way as chorish, there is never a case where there's a mitzvah to do charisha, to plow. You never have to plow for a mitzvah. So in the same way as chorish is always ever only going to be reshus, something you're allowed to do, not something you have to do. And it says it's also on Shabbos. Af kotzer, so too regarding the harvesting, the cutting down of the produce, reshus, it's only also on Shabbos when it's reshus, when it's not a mitzvah. Yotza, however, this excludes ktsir ha'omer, cutting down the produce for the omer. shehu mitzvah, that there's a mitzvah to cut the oimer. We have to cut the oimer. It's a pasuk in the Torah, and that is mutter to do that on Shabbos. That is how the Gemara here is learning, and this is a sugis elsewhere in Shas, which we don't need to go into here. But this is what the Yerushalmi here is saying. And from the fact that Rabbi Shmuel says that you're allowed to do the Ktsira on Shabbos, we obviously learn from here, and there's a very big discussion in the Mefarshim how we learn it from here, but we take it for granted that if it's so important to do the Ktsira and all the details mentioned in the Pasuk in the absolute way, up to the extent that you're even allowed to do the Ktsira on Shabbos, then obviously the fact that it says in the Torah it should be brought from Eretz Yisrael is also something that has to be kept, and it cannot be brought even from Surya. Continues the Gemara. Man Tana Shoimrei Sfichis B'Shvius. Who holds that, like we saw in our Mishnah, that Shoimrei Sfichin B'Shvius Noitlin Schoron Mitrumas Halishka, we pay those who are guarding the barley, the wheat, the produce of Shemitah that grows on its own on Shemitah, that you guard it in order that nobody should cut it down, in order for it to be used for the Shtei Alechem and for the Korban Omer. Who holds that you're allowed to guard Shemitah fruits, Shemitah produce, and obviously if you're allowed to guard it, only because you're allowed to guard it, you're allowed to pay the people, the guards, with the money of the Trumas Halishka. Well, who holds that way? Why can't you just bring the Tvua from Surya? Who says that you cannot bring it from Surya, and therefore you have to guard the produce of Eretz Yisrael? Man Tana Shomer Sviches B'Shvius Noitlin Schoron Mitrumas Halishka. Says the Gemara Rabbi Shmuel, here again it must be Rabbi Shmuel. That's what the Gemara assumes, because as we saw a few minutes ago, that Rabbi Shmuel holds that Ein Omer Ba Min Asuria, that the Omer has to be brought from Eretz Yisrael. If it has to be brought from Eretz Yisrael, then on Shemitah you have to guard the little bit of Sfichin that grows. And since you have to guard it, you can pay the guards with the Trumas Halishka. Omer Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef argues and says Divrei Hakilhi, that everybody agrees with this. Why? Because Loi Motzi B'Surya, in the event that you don't find any produce in Surya, then everybody agrees that you have to bring it from produce in Eretz Yisrael. And since you don't know if you're going to find Tvua in Surya, therefore everybody agrees, even according to the opinion that says you're allowed to bring the Omer from produce of Surya, also agree that you're allowed to guard the produce of the Sfichin of Eretz Yisrael, because you never know in advance whether you're actually going to find Tvua in Surya to be used for the Omer and the Shtei Alechem. Continues the Gemara. Hahein Omer Mao Sheyizra B'Tchila. We've learned that even though regular Shemitah produce is Hefka, over here because of the Korban Omer you're allowed to guard them. And we also learned that you're allowed to cut it down in Shvius. Normally you're not allowed to cut down such a large amount of Tvua in Shemitah. But because of the Korban Omer, you're allowed to. The question is, if there isn't any Tvua around, are you actually allowed to plant some of this Tvua, some of these grains, on Shemitah? In the same way as you're allowed to cut it down, which is normally also on Shemitah, you're allowed to do it. Are you allowed to plant it, something which is normally also, are you allowed to do it for the Korban Omer? Says the Gemara, Reb Chia bar Ada, boye kamei Reb Muna. Reb Chia asked in front of Reb Muna, what would it help you if you planted it? What would it help? Lo nimtza kekoimetz al hashirayim she'eino necholim. We know that the halacha is that when is any korban mincha, in most cases a korban mincha, a koimetz, a fistful, is removed and put on the mizbeach, the shirayim, the leftovers, are eaten. A case where the shirayim are not allowed to be eaten, the whole mincha is parcel. You don't bring the shirayim at all, you don't bring the koimetz, it's parcel. Over here, even if you would be allowed to plant in order to have the korban omer, of which a fistful of it is going to go onto the mizbeach, but are you going to be allowed to eat the rest of the korban, the shirayim? You're not going to be allowed to eat the rest, because any fruits which are planted, any produce planted in Shemitah, you're not allowed to eat it at all. It becomes asa. So what does it help? Even if you would be allowed to plant, it wouldn't help you anything. Says the Gemara, no, it would help you. Why would it help you? It's because it's similar to 5 cases, and it happens to be that Omer is one of those 5, that it's allowed to be brought even betuma. And when a korban omer is brought b'tumah, the fistful gets put on the mizbeach, even though it's tomei, but the shirayim, which is tomei, you're not allowed to eat, and nonetheless it's kosher. In the same way as a tomei, it's kosher, so too, it would be kosher to plant or to use produce that's been planted in Shemitah, to use it for the korban omer, and it would still be kosher. And it seems the Gemara just says that there's a place for the question. Right? We asked a question. Ha'omer ma'u shehiz Rabbi Tchila. Rabbi Chia asked, it wouldn't help. We answered it would help. But we haven't been given a clear answer. Are you actually allowed to sow and plant in Shemitah? The Yerushalmi did not give an answer. Other Mefarshim say that the Yerushalmi did give an answer, and the same way as Tumah is one's allowed to bring the omer from Tumah, even though you cannot eat the shirayim, then planting in Shemitah is in that bracket and you're allowed to do that as well. But the Takrin Chadtin doesn't seem to learn that way. Continues the Gemara. Keitzatu Oisa. We saw in the Mishnah that these people, the guards that are guarding the Svichei Shemitah, in order to be able to have produce for the korban omer, you're allowed to pay their wages from the Trumas Halishka, from the money that was withdrawn from the chamber with all those machzis hashekel in. Well, how are you actually going to pay them? Are you going to take coins of kedusha, of the Trumas Halishka, and give it to them? We have an issue with that, because you cannot just take coins of kedusha and give it to somebody. What's going to make it chulin? These workers, these people who are guarding it, are going to be using it for whatever they want to use it for. That means it became chulin. Well, kedusha has to be chal on something. It has to be redeemed on something. The kedusha has to be transmitted or transferred onto something. Over here, it's not transferred on anything. This person did some work. He guarded the produce, and now, where's the kedusha of these coins gone to? So the Gemara is asking, Keitzadu Oisa. So how in practical terms are we going to use these coins as payment for the wages? Says the Gemara, Noitel mois min hashulchani. At first, and this is right at the beginning, obviously even before they have acquired, before the produce has grown a substantial amount, because if they guard it before, on their own accord, without being paid, they guard it, it becomes their own, and we don't want it to become their own. The reason that we're paying them is in order it should belong to hektish. So right at the beginning, we take coins of the shulchani, we borrow coins from the money changer, and we give it as payment. These are your wages. Now you're employed by us hektish, and you are protecting this tzvichen for hektish, and it belongs to hektish. Now what? V'noisen lekoitzrim, and they give ulashoimrim achelo yikrav omer, and they give the money to the people who are cutting down the tvua, and to the people, all the people who have to be paid for the whole process of the omer, they get paid. Umeivi mois mitrumas halishka umechalin olov, and afterwards, after they've already cut down the omer, and that omer is not yet hektish, that those grains, those stalks that have been cut down, that were going to be used for the korban omer, have not yet been made kodesh, so they are chulin. So now what they do is they take coins from the Chumas Halishka, and they say that the kedusha of those coins will be redeemed onto these stalks. And now the stalks are kodesh in their place, and you now have coins whose kedusha has been removed and put onto the stalks, and the coins are now chulin. And then they take these coins and they give the coins back to the money changers. Asks the Gemara, V'tovis kain? Is this a good way of doing it, what you just did now? There's an issue with it, because their wages are going to be wages of having protected all the kernels, all the stalks that they watched, which is quite a large sum. But in practical terms, they were going to now take the kedusha of the worth of coins, of the worth of all those stalks, and put that kedusha onto the stalks. What's actually going to happen to these stalks? How much of these stalks is actually going to become part of the korban? Not that much. Only a tenth of it is going to become the korban. The rest is just going to be waste. It's going to be put through the sieves, and it's going to be winnowed and thrashed, and not that much is going to be left over. So you're taking a large amount of coins from the Trumas Halishka to the value of all those stalks, and because that's the wages that you're giving these people for having protected those and guarded and done everything that had to be done with those stalks, where only in actual fact a small amount of that is actually going to become the korban. Says the Gemara, yes. The wages of the people, the amount of money that you borrowed and have to return, is not the value of what these stalks are before you've thrashed them and prepared them. No. The final wages is the value of the tvua, of these grains, but not of the whole lot. The amount that is actually going to be used in the korban omer itself, that is the wages of these shomrim, and that's as much money is going to be borrowed on their behalf. That's as much money which is then going to be redeemed. The kedusha is going to be redeemed onto that part of the grain that's going to become the korban omer, and that's what's going to be returned to the people who lent the money, and therefore there's no issue. Continues the Gemara Tana. We learned that af bepischei avonim, those people who on behalf of the Beis Hamikdash were chiseling stones, were cornering and doing whatever had to be done with the working with the stones, they would also get paid from the hektish. How would they pay them? Is noitel mois mishulchani. They would borrow money, as we saw before. They would borrow money from the money changers. They would give it to the people who are digging for the stones and doing whatever it took to prepare the stones. And even before they fixed the stones into the walls and into the buildings, even before they actually finished their work, they would first get paid. And only after they would finish repairing the wall that they were supposed to repair, maybe mois mit trumas halishka, they would bring coins from the trumas halishka, and they would redeem them, they would redeem the kedusha onto this new part of the building, and now you'd have coins that have been stripped of their kedusha, and they would be given as wages to these people who are working for the Beis Hamikdash. Asks the Gemara of Tavis Kain, is it appropriate to do that? They're getting paid for all the work they did, but it's inevitable that some of the work they did, some of the stones that they used and that they dug and that they chiseled and everything they did, part of it went to waste. So you had to borrow more money than was actually going to carry the kedusha of those coins. And again, Rabbi Yosi ber Bun b'Shem Shmuel, the same answer. Kol ma sheyitain hein domer mishar rishona. Their wages, right from the beginning, the amount that they're being paid, is not the amount of all the little work they did, but is the value of the stones as of the final product, as of the final job. As much as the stones are now worth, as much as the building has now gone up in value, that's what their wages are, and that's as much kedusha that can be redeemed from the coins onto those stones, and that's what would be their wages. That's the amount they would borrow to start with, and the amount that they would afterwards pay back. Continues the next Mishnah, Yud Amud Beis, Halacha Beis. And now we're going to discuss different things that were done with the Trumas Halishka, part of which we already discussed in the previous Mishnah. And besides for that, we're also going to discuss in the coming sugyas what was done with the Shiore Halishka, the money that was left over in the chamber that was never withdrawn. What's going to be done with the Moiser Shiore Halishka? What happens after you've done what you can with the remaining money in those chambers? What do you do with the last coins that are left over? What do you do with the Moiser Hatruma, the money that's left in the boxes that you withdrew? 3 times a year you withdraw money from the chamber into the boxes to be used as one uses the Trumas Halishka. What happens if there's money left in those boxes? And besides for that, we're going to discuss with Moisar HaPeiros and Moisar Nesachim, which is going to be discussed exactly what they are in the Gemara. Says the Mishnah, we're going to start with a number of things that are done with the Trumas Halishka. A Para Aduma is a korban that the tzibur needed, and they would buy and do whatever had to be done with the Para Aduma with the money of the Trumas Halishka. V'soira mishtalech. Then we know that on Yom Kippur 2 goats were used. One was going to be a korban on the Mizbeach, the other one was going to be sent LaAzazel. And since you don't know in advance which one was going to be LaShem, which one is LaAzazel, both animals are bought from the Trumas Halishka. V'loshin shel zahiris, which is the piece of material, the piece of wool that was used, and not only the piece of wool, it's also the eitz erez and the ezoiv, which was used for when burning the Parah Aduma, that was also taken from the Trumas Halishka. All this boin mitrumas Halishka. Continues the Mishnah. And now we're having the Mishnah is going to tell us a list of things that you don't use from the Trumas Halishka, but the money that's left over in the Lishka that you didn't use, that was not withdrawn with the Trumas Halishka, but the remaining coins, what would they do with them? They would do with them tzorchei tzibur, things that the tzibur, the community, needed. What are they? Kevesh Para. There was a special ramp that was made from the Beis Hamikdash until the place where they would burn the Parah Aduma, and this was a ramp that was made in a special type of construction to make sure that even in the event, the unknown event, that there was a corpse buried someplace in the ground, and we know that's called Tumas HaTahoim, that if there's a corpse buried, then the Tumah penetrates, it goes all the way up till the sky, unless there is a tefach, there is a roofed-in area, an airspace of a tefach high, and that blocks the tumah from going. So what they would have to do is they would have to build a ramp that at any given point there was at least a tefach of airspace between the rock, the land underneath it, and the people on top of it. And what they would do is they would, because if any ramp has to be built on supports, and a support is not hollow, it's solid. So if there's something that's going to be buried exactly under that support, the tumah is going to go right up through it and penetrate and make the person tomei who's walking on top of it. So what they would do is they would have a double layered ramp where the supports are held on an area, on a roofing, so to speak, that has supports elsewhere. That means at every given point, it's kippin al gabe kippin. At every given point, there was always some airspace between the rock below and the people on top. So this kevesh, this ramp that was made for the Parah Aduma, or the kevesh soira mishtalech, when the person would go with the goat on Yom Kippur and take it till the Azazel, there was a time where the people from Bovel, the Babylonian, the people, they were so anxious to get their atonement that they would tear their hair out of this animal and force the person who's taking it along to the Azazel, quickly run and give us our atonement. To avoid them being able to do that, there would be a special ramp that would go all the way to where this person had to go and do what he had to do with this goat. Veloshin shebein karnov, and the wool, the red wool that was put between the horns of this goat, that was also, it was traveled with this loshin, with this tongue, as literally it looked like a tongue, but it was a piece of material, a piece of wool between its horns, and when he would get to the top of that mountain, the Azazel, he would cut it into two, half remaining between the horns, half he would tie to a rock. He would then throw the goat over the rocks, and he would know if this wool turned its color, changed from red to white, he would know that it was a message from Hashem, a sign from Hashem that they had been atoned. So this loshin shebein karnov, between its horns, also was bought is in this bracket. It was bought from the shiore alishka, from the coins that were left in the chamber that were not removed. V'amas hamayim, there was a stream, a canal that was going through the Beis Hamikdash, and when that needed repairing and upkeep, they would use this money for it. V'choymoi sa'ir, and the walls of Yerushalayim, u'migdoleo, and its towers, v'chol tzorkei ha'ir, and anything else that was needed to dig the wells, the pits, or to take care of the streets and the public places. Boin mishiore halishka, all these things were done with the shiore halishka. Now, one of those details, Abba Shaul is arguing, Abba Shaul Omer, kevesh para, the ramp that was made for the Parah Aduma, when the Kohanim would take the Parah Aduma to where it had to be burnt, that was not done from the shiore halishka, rather Kohanim gedolim oisin mishel atzmon, it was actually paid out of pocket from the Kohen Gadol that was overseeing and doing the Parah Aduma. Continues the Mishnah, and this is actually a new Mishnah according to Taklin Chadatin. This Mishnah actually comes later on in the Yerushalmi, but it's printed here. Let's learn it here. Says the Mishnah, Moisar Shiore Halishka. What happens if there was money left in the chambers and you've done all the above with it? You've taken care of the tzorchei hatzibur and there's still some coins left. What do we do with the remaining coins when you have nothing left yet or any more to do with it for the tzibur? Mao yoisen behen. So Rabbi Shmuel says, loikhin behen, they would buy with it yeinois, wines, shmonim, oils, salsos and flowers, and they would sell it to the people who would need these commodities for their korban mincha, and they would sell it for a higher price than they bought it for. Vaschar lehegdush, and that way they would so to speak be investing that money, trying to make a profit that would benefit hekdush. Divi Rabbi Shmuel, that was the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva argued, Rabbi Kiva Omer, ein mistakrin b'shel hekdush, you don't do business transactions with hekdush, because there's always this fear that you may make a loss. You may end up selling it for less than they were bought for, or the price may drop, and then hekdush will have lost. So you don't do transactions with hekdush. Afloi mishel aniyim, and if you have money belonging to poor people that you collected for poor people, don't try and invest it hoping it will make money. You might lose it, and therefore just leave it as it is. Continues the Mishnah, and this is yet another Mishnah according to Taklin Chaditin, but says the Mishnah, Moisar hatruma. What happens if after the 12 months and there's now money left in the boxes, you withdrew from the chamber into the boxes, and now the year is over and you have to withdraw new coins from the New Year's Shkalim? What do you do with the remaining coins that have already been withdrawn with the intentions of being used for Korban Tzibur? But that's it, the year's over, we've bought all our Korbanos, we've finished buying the Korbanos of the year. What do we do with the remaining coins? Now, what would they do with it? Says the Mishnah, Reku'ei Zohov, this is the Tanakama. Tanakama holds they would create with it sheets of gold, tzipui, they would use these sheets to cover lebeis kodesh hakadoshim, for the floors and the walls of the kodesh hakadoshim. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Rabbi Shmuel says, he argues with the Tanakama, and he says Moisar HaPeiros, which is a concept we haven't yet seen. We'll see in the Gemara what it means. But the Moisar HaPeiros was used kayetz hamizbeach, so to speak, as a dessert for the mizbeach. The same way as a dessert, when a person's finished the meal, he's now going to eat a little bit of dessert. So too, when the mizbeach is empty and there's no more korbanos burning on it, they would bring korban oilos and put on the mizbeach just to keep the mizbeach, so to speak, satisfied. There should always be korbanos on it. Moisar truma, and this moisar truma that we discussed before, not like the Tanakama who said that the moisar truma was used for the reku'ei zav. No, Rabbi Shmuel says, what was the moisar truma used for? Liklei shoris. They would use it to purchase the utensils, the vessels needed in the Beis Hamikdash, the klei shoris. That's what they would use it for. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Rabbi Kiva is yet a third opinion. He says that Moisar Truma is lekayetz hamizbeach, that they would use the Moisar Truma, the leftover coins which was withdrawn from the chamber, they would use it for the kayetz hamizbeach. And the reason that behind what Rabbi Kiva says is because the Trumas Halishka was originally set aside in order to use it for Korbanos Tzibur. And now the year is over. These coins are left over, but at least use it for Korbanos Tzibur. What would they do? They would use it for the Kayetz HaMizbeach. Moisar Nesochim. And this is a new concept we haven't yet seen, but Rabbi Kiva says that Moisar Nesochim, we'll see soon what it means, was the klei shoris. That's what they would use to buy the klei shoris. And Rabbi Kiva doesn't make any mention of Moisar Peiros. Rabbi Shmuel said Moisar Peiros is Kayetz HaMizbeach. Rabbi Kiva sort of ignores the Moisar HaPeiros, and we'll soon discuss that. The Mishnah is going to mention that. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim says that Moisar Nesachim is not like Rabbi Kiva said that Moisar Nesachim is for klei shoris. No, Reb Chanina Skana Kohanim said that Kayetz HaMizbeach, they would use the Moisar Nesochim for the Kayetz HaMizbeach. Moisar HaTruma, coming back to Moisar HaTruma, what would he do with it? Like klei shoris, which is Reb Chanina Skana Kohanim saying the same as Rabbi Shmuel said before, that they would use the Moisar HaTruma for klei shoris. Zeh v'zeh, But Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, both of them, lo hayu moedim b'peiros, they both ignored the concept of Moisar HaPeiros. They didn't agree with the concept of Moisar HaPeiros, and we'll see in the Gemara what Moisar HaPeiros is and what they didn't agree with. Says the Gemara, Kevesh, Pora, Chulei. And that was the Mishnah. The second statement in the Mishnah was a list of things that they would do with the Shiore Alishka, with the money, the coins that were left in the chambers. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonason. Rabbi Yonason held, Gimel l'shoynos hein. There were actually 3 times where there was this strand of wool that was used. And each time it had to be of different weight. There was one which was shel soyer, which the Mishnah mentioned, the loshoin bein karanov, they would put between its horns of the soyer, of the lazazel, and how much did that have to weigh? Besela, it had to weigh a full sela, which is 2 shkalim, because it had to be of enough volume, enough weight, that it could actually be split into 2, that half was left on the horns of the goat, and another half was tied to the stone. Shel Metzeira, the loshoin, the piece of wool, the red piece of wool that was used to sprinkle on the Metzeira, b'shekel, it was enough to be just half a sela, because they didn't need to be split into 2, and it was enough if it was weighed a sela. Shel Pora, the piece of wool that was used with the Pora Aduma, which is what we mentioned before, the loshoin shel Zahiris, which the Mishnah mentioned, that was that wool for the Pora Aduma b'shnei slime. It had to be double even of the Lashonis of the Lashon of the Soyer, because over there it says that you had to throw it right into the bottom of the fire, or into the midst of the fire that was burning the Pora Aduma. And if it didn't have a substantial weight, it would just get burnt at the top, and it wouldn't actually fall right into the middle of the fire, and that's why it had to be of 2 slime. A second opinion, Reb Chunya de Bras Chivrin, Reb Chunya from this place called Bras Chivrin, he said that Rebbe Bo bar Zavda b'shem Reb Shimon ben Chalafta, they said shel Pora b'shtei slaim u'mechza, that the wool that was used and thrown into the fire when burning the Pora Aduma it wasn't enough that it was just 2 slime, it had to be 2.5 slime, even a little bit heavier. Is to mafkin lishna, others would say the same weight, but they wouldn't use the term 2.5 slime, they would use the term ba'asara zuz, and just depending on how they received this halacha from their rebbes, whether they said it in this term or in that term, but it was the same weight. 10 zuz is 2.5 slime. They held it had to be that heavy. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Reb Shmuel. And now we're bringing a list of other halachas of what could be done with the Trumas Halishka. Says the Gemara, Talmidei Chachomim hamelamdim nesakoyanim, those Talmidei Chachomim, the teachers that will teach the Koyanim, Hilchas Shchita, how to shecht, Hilchas Kabbalah, how to receive the blood, Hilchas Rika, how to sprinkle or throw the blood, Noitlin Schoron, they would take their wages, Mitrumas Halishka, from the money that was withdrawn from this chamber. Continues the Gemara, Yitzchok bar Adifa b'shem Reb Ami, he said that Mevakrei Mumei Kochim, those that would examine the animals to make sure there were no blemishes, they would also have to be paid. Noitlin Schoron, they also would take their wages, Mitrumas Halishka, from the coins that were withdrawn from the chamber. Another halacha, Reb Acha says that Reb Tamchoim bar Chia b'shem Reb Sumloi, that Magihei Sefer HaAzara, those that would correct and check the Sefer Torah in the Azara, also Noitlin Schoron with Trumas Halishka, they would take their wages from the Trumas Halishka. Gidel bar Binyamin b'shem Reb Asi, Shnei Dayonei Gzeilos. There was 2 Dayonim that was their job to determine the fines that were given to the thieves. They would also be paid. They would spend all day just judging and doing their job there. Noitlin Schoron with Trumas Halishka, they would also take their wages from the chamber. Shmuel Omar, Noshim, these women, who would weave the curtains between the ulam and between the heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the first Beis HaMikdash, there was an amma thick wall there. However, in the second Beis HaMikdash, that was made considerably taller than the first Beis HaMikdash, it wasn't possible to make such a tall wall, just an amma wide, an amma thick, and you couldn't make it any thicker because that would take away from the dimensions either of the Heichal or of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So what they did instead was they had a double curtain with an amma gap in between, and this curtain, Shmuel says, Noitlin Schoron, that the women that would weave these curtains, they would take their schar, their wages, mitrumas halishka, from this chamber. Reb Chuna Omar, mitrumas bedek habayis. Reb Chuna will hold that they would take their wages not from what was withdrawn from the chamber, rather they would take it from the bedek habayis, people who would donate money for maintaining and the upkeep of the building. They would say this is like part of the upkeep of the building, it's in the place of the wall that was there, and therefore they would get paid wages from the bedek habayis. Ma pligi. What's the point of their machlokas? In what point are they arguing? Shmuel ovad lo kekelim. Shmuel held that these curtains had the same halachas of kelim, and the kelim, they were taken from the trumas halishka. Rav Huna ovad lo kebinyan. However, Rav Huna assumed that it had the same halachas as the building, and any upkeep or maintenance of the building was taken from the bedek habayis. And Shmuel, who said that they would get paid because these curtains were similar to kelim, is following Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah that says that from the Moisar HaTruma, from the coins remaining of these coins that were withdrawn, they would use it for klei shoris, and Shmuel viewed these curtains as being similar to those klei shoris. That's the Vilna Gaon's girsa here. Continues the Gemara. Omer of Chizkiah. Rabbi Chizkiah said that Tana Rabbi Yehuda Gad Godois. That was his name, Rabbi Yehuda Gad Godois. He says that Hakteires v'chol korbanis hatzibur boin mitrumas halishka. All communal korbanis, including the Hakteires, was paid for from the withdrawal of this chamber. Mizbeach Hazav. However, the making and the upkeep of the Mizbeach, the gold Mizbeach that was inside the Heichal, v'chol klei shoris, and all the klei shoris, the utensils, boin mimoisar nesachim. They would come from the moisar nesachim, as we saw. Rabbi Akiva said in the Mishnah that moisar nesachim was used for klei shoris. The Mizbeach Hazav was relatively small; it was not attached to the ground. It had the same status as the klei shoris. Mizbeach ha'elo. However, the big Mizbeach outside in the Azara, v'aheichal v'azaros, boin mi bedek habayis. They were part of the building, and maintenance of the building was done with the bedek habayis. That's the giros of the Vilna Gaon. Chutz la'azaros, anything that was outside the Azara, boin mishiori alishka, was brought with those coins that were left over after they'd withdrawn money from the chamber. All the machzah shekels, the leftover coins, they would use for anything that was outside the Azoris. Asks the Gemara, V'atoni avnei Yerushalayim moyalin behem. Did we not learn that the concept of Me'ilah applies even to the stones of Yerushalayim, and the stones of Yerushalayim came from outside, were beyond the Azara, was outside the Azara, and what you just said now, that anything that was from outside Chutz LaAzaris came from the Shiori Alishka, v'chiyesh Me'ilah b'shirayim, is there any, it might be also to have personal benefit from it, but is there any concept of Me'ilah with those coins that are left over in the chamber? Of course there isn't, and if there isn't, how can you say that there's Me'ilah from Yerushalayim, from the stones of Yerushalayim? So answers the Gemara, Reb Meir. This is following Reb Meir, who Reb Meir Oimer, Me'alin b'shirayim. Reb Meir holds that actually the concept of Me'ilah does apply to the remaining coins in the chamber, and therefore it's okay to say that the Yerushalayim, which is Chutz LaAzara, is outside the Azara, was maintained and built using the money of the Shiori Alishka, and nonetheless we say that there's a concept of Me'ilah by the stones of Yerushalayim. It's not a contradiction, because Reb Meir holds the concept of Me'ilah applies even to those remaining coins. Asks the Gemara, Amar Reb Chia, Klum Amar Reb Meir ela b'teich shnasei, v'hacha chutz l'shnasei anan kayomin. Even Reb Meir only says there's Me'ilah till the end of the year, till the end of the 12 months, but as soon as they start collecting the next year's coins, then the remaining coins of the previous year are definitely, there's no me'ilah, and we assume over here that the upkeep of Yerushalayim was only done when the year was over, as we've seen previously in the Gemara already, early on in the Masechta, that all the while that the coins were still there, they would leave it there because they never knew would there be enough coins with what they withdrew in order for the Karbanos Tzibur. So any remaining coins would be left just for the eventuality that you might need it for Karbanos. Only when the year is over, they would use it for whatever, they would use the Masechet Shkalim Daf or whatever else, or the Shiur Alishka would only be after the year is over. So since after the year is over, even Rabbi Meir says there's no me'ilah, the question comes back. And therefore it must be that not like Reb Yehuda Gudgodu said that they would build Yerushalayim, that Chutz Lazoris was boin Mishiore Halishka, that cannot be. If we see that there's a concept of Avnei Yerushalayim, there's a possible Yesh Me'ilah, that it's possible to have Me'ilah with Avnei Yerushalayim, it cannot be that the Avnei Yerushalayim Chutz Lazoris was maintained by the Shiore Halishka. Continues the Gemara. Omer B'chizkiah, Tan Rabbi Yehuda Godgonios. Rabbi Yehuda Godgonios said as follows: Hashulchan, v'amenorah, v'mizbeichos, v'paroiches. These four items, ma'akvinis hakorbonis. If they're not there, the korbonis are possible. It's ma'akiv. Divi Reb Meir, that's the opinion of Reb Meir. The Chachamim oimrim. The Chachamim argue. It says machlokes tanoim. The Chachamim argue. Ein nocha ma'akiv es hakorban. The only thing that is ma'akiv the korban is only karkoiv v'keren. Bilvad. The karkoiv is this decorated band that was going round the Mizbeach. The Keren is the horns on the four corners, what we call the Karnei HaMizbeach, the four corners protruding at the top of the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach, with its various parts, is Ma'akev. But the Shulchan and the Menorah and the Paroiches is not Ma'akev. So that is a machlokes tanoim. Reb Meir says that the Shulchan, Menorah, Mizbeiches and Paroiches are ma'akev. The Chachamim say just the Mizbeach. And now the Gemara is going to ask a question that we're going to see three Amoraim argue, and they're all arguing with the Chachamim, and two of them are arguing with Reb Meir. And we don't have Amoraim arguing with Tanoim. Says the Gemara, V'loi kein Omer Reb Eliezer v'Reb Yosi bar Chanina. What did Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina Trey and Omrin, that they both said Kol Hein Dechsiv Noichach, whenever it says in the pasuk that the position of a kli has to be Noichach, has to be opposite someplace, Ma'akev. And the only place it says Noichach is by the Menorah. So Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina say the only thing which is Ma'akev is the Menorah. Tzela, however, when the pasuk says that one of the kelim have to be noichach, have to be tzela, on the side of some place, eine ma'akev, and that's referring to the shulchan. The shulchan, the pasuk says it has to be on the side, it has to be in the tzela, and it's not ma'akev. V'omer Reb Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonason, afilu tzela. Rabbi Yonason says no, even not only where it says Noichach, referring to the Menorah, also where it says Tzela, referring to the Shulchan, it's also Ma'akev. V'omer Reb Ila b'shem Reb Shmuel bar Nachman. Reb Ila said in the name of Reb Shmuel bar Nachman, a third opinion, afilu sima. Even when it says in the pasuk, set in place, it has to be put in some place, which is actually referring to all of them, the Orin, the Mizbeach, the Paroiches, and all the other Kelim, then it's Ma'akev. So Reb Shmuel bar Nachman can hold of the opinion of Reb Meir, who says that Shulchan, Menorah, Mizbeiches, and Paroiches are Ma'akev. But none of them hold of the Chachamim, who says that only the Mizbeach is Ma'akev. And how can you have Amoraim arguing with the Tanoim? Answers the Gemara, Omer of Chinena, kan ba'avoidos shebifnim, kan ba'avoidos shebechutz. Those avoidos, the part of the avoid in the Beis Hamikdash that was done outside the Heichal, that was done in the Azara, that is when there's a machlokes between Reb Meir and the Chachamim. Reb Meir says the Shulchan, Menorah, Mizbeiches, and Paroiches are Ma'akev, and the Chachamim say only the Mizbeach is Ma'akev. However, the avoidus shebifnim, those avoidus that were done inside the Heichal, there it's nothing to do with those Tanoim. That is what these Amoraim are arguing of: is it just the Menorah which is Ma'akev? Is it the Menorah and the Shulchan? Or is it the Menorah, the Shulchan, and all the other Kelim? Continues the Gemara, Omer of Chanina. Shachtzis gedoila, some haughtiness and a bad trait of shachtzonus, a certain haughtiness, was rampant amongst the Kohen Gadol. More than 60 kikar of gold, they would be their expenses, they would give out, that even though the ramp that was going to be used for the Parah Aduma, the special ramp that was built on these supports that would make sure that at every given point there was an air gap of tefach underneath it, that even though it was still oimid from the previous Parah Aduma that was done by a previous Kohen Gadol, and nonetheless none of the Kohen Gadol would use the ramp of the previous Kohen Gadol, he would demolish it, and he would build this ramp from his own money. And that's very haughty and a proud thing to do. Why can't you use the ramp that was made by a previous Kohen Gadol? Rav Ulla asked Rav Mona, and he says, I agree with you that each Kohen Gadol, he built his own ramp, but I don't think it was coming from a negative place. Why? How do I know? We learned explicitly that Shimon HaTzadik, Shtei Poris also. In the time of Shimon HaTzadik, there were many people that were Tmei Meisim. It was a time of war. Many people had come into contact with corpses, and he had to make 2 Parah Adumos. And Loi Bekevesh Shehoitzi, he himself demolished the ramp that he himself made for the first Parah Aduma in order to make a new ramp for the second Parah Aduma. Is it possible to say Shimon HaTzadik Shachatzaya, that Shimon HaTzadik had these bad traits? And number one, as a person, it didn't make sense that he had these bad traits, and number two, it didn't even make sense because it was his own ramp that he was demolishing. So indeed, why did all the Kohen Gadol destroy and demolish the previous ramps and build new ones? Says the Gemara, Al Shem Maila Hibapara, Silsul Hibapara, discussed in other places in Shas, but they had reason to make a very big fuss about the high standards of Kedusha and Tara that was needed when doing the Parah Aduma, and the honor they gave the Parah Aduma, and that was to combat the heretic opinions of the Tzidukim, and it's a complicated sugya which we don't need to go into here, but that's why they went out of their way to make a very big fuss and to show, to go to the nth degree with pointing out and expressing the details of Tahara, that when they would make this ramp, which was just one of these chumras, in order to Maila of Para and Silsul of Para, therefore they would every time create a new ramp, making the statement again. Continues the Gemara. Another example of the degree they went to make sure that there would be absolute Kedusha and Tahara when making this, the ramp, or the Parah Aduma. Tani, we learned that Zizin Uksolim, on this ramp there were beams protruding and walls on the sides, Hayoitzin Mikan or Mikan, that would be on either side of this ramp. If the Kohanim were going to suddenly get distracted by something beyond the ramp, and they're going to put their heads, they're going to lean over off the end of the ramp, they may be hovering over a place that's deep down in the ground, in the rock, the corpse is buried, and then they would become tomei. To avoid that, they would even make walls on the edge of this ramp to make sure that they could not hover over the edges. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Kiva Omer ein mistakrim. We saw in the Mishnah that there was a question what they should do with the Moiser Shiori Alishka. What to do with the remaining coins in this chamber after they'd used whatever they could for the tzibur. And Rabbi Kiva said they would invest it in the wine, the oils, the flour, and sell it. And the profits, Rabbi Shmuel said they would do that and the profits would go to Hegdush. Rabbi Kiva said, Ein mistakrim b'shel Hegdush, you should not invest money belonging to Hegdush or belonging to poor people. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Kiva Omer ein mistakrim chulu. However, what was the reason that they should not invest the money of Hegdush is because you might make a loss. You might sell it for less, the price might go down, and then you'll have lost for Hegdush. Elohim rotzo, if somebody says, I'm happy to invest Hegdush's money, but on condition that if it incurs a loss, it's on me. If there's a gain, then the gain will go, or part of the gains will go to Hekdesh, then it's okay. If he's committed to take the losses on himself, in that way, in any case, Hekdesh will not lose, it'll only gain, then it's a mutter, then it's okay. Kahador Barazimna, like this person called Barazimna, that itpeged, it was deposited, they deposited by him, Gabei, by him, Midal Diasoimen, money that was collected for orphans. Also v'shoal l'Rebbi Mona, and they asked, and he went and asked Rav Mona, can he invest that money on behalf of the orphans? Omalei said, in bois, if you are prepared, di ha'hefseido didoch, that the losses will be on you, v'agra de tarvaichun, and the gains will be shared between you and the orphans. Shari, in that case, it's mutter. Says the Gemara, B'chia bar Ada, is paked gabei midaldi yisaymin. He also, they deposited by him money that was collected for the orphans. V'avid Cain, he did this, he invested it, but he agreed to take the losses on himself. Continues the Gemara. Moisar Peiris. We saw towards the end of the Mishnah that there was a concept called Moisar HaPeiris and a concept called Moisar Nesochim. And we said that Moisar Peiris, there was, Rabbi Shmuel said they would use it for the kites of the Mizbeach, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina's Kanakeanim ignored it, which means they didn't hold of this concept called Moisar HaPeiris. Regarding Moisar Nesachim, we saw Rabbi Akiva said they would use it for Kli Sharis, Rabbi Chanina's Kanakeanim said they would use it for kites HaMizbeach, for the Oilos when the Mizbeach was empty. And we don't yet know what is Moisar HaPeiris, what is Moisar Nesachim. Says the Gemara, Moisar Peiris, Masnisin de Rabbi Shmuel he. This Moisar Peiris is who was the only one that told us what to do with Moisar Peiris? Rabbi Shmuel. He said it's Kayetz HaMizbeach. But if you want to understand it, look earlier on in the Mishnah and have a look. What does Rabbi Shmuel say? So going back to the Moisar Shiur Alishka, what do you do with the remaining coins in the chamber that were not used and didn't need to be used for the tzibur? So we saw there Rabbi Shmuel said, invest it in wine, oils and flour, make some money, and the profits will go to Hegdish. So says the Gemara, the Rabbi Bar Yosef Posar Masnita, it was Rabbi Bar Yosef who explained the Mishnah, who says here that Moisar HaPeiros, Rabbi Shmuel says, goes for the Kayetz HaMizbeach. What is Moisar HaPeiros? It's Schar LeHekdesh. It is that Schar, Rabbi Shmuel himself. He was the one that said that you can invest the Moisar Shiur Alishka, those profits that were made, that is called the Moisar HaPeiros. What do you do with those profits? Rabbi Shmuel said, Kayetz HaMizbeach. Moisar Nesachim. What does Rabbi Chia say? What is Moisar Nesachim, which we saw as a machlekes of Akiva and Rabbi Chanina's Kanakeanim what to do with it? But what is the concept of Moisar Nesachim? Says Rabbi Chia, it's Zu Sa Revius. If a person committed himself to give a seller's worth of food to the Beis Hamikdash, and when he made that commitment, a seller could buy 4 sa, which is a volume of produce, of fruits, vegetables, whatever it may be. The seller could buy 4 sa. When he actually came to the Beis Hamikdash, he brought his seller. At that point, a seller could only buy 3 sa, which means that a seller had actually gone, that the fruits had actually gone up in value, and now each sa is not a quarter of a seller, it's a third of a seller. He said, I'm coming with a seller, that's why I committed myself, and the Hegdish will only get 3 sa. The halacha is no. You have to give the 4th sa, because when you committed yourself to a seller, it was 4 sa. This 4th sa is called Moisar Nesachim, according to Rabbi Chia. Moisar Nesachim zu sa revius is this 4th sa. What do you do with it? So we saw it's machlekes in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva says you buy klei sharos with it, and Rabbi Chanina's Kanakeanim says it's for Kayetz HaMizbeach. That was Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Chia says that Moisar HaPeiros is only Rabbi Shmuel himself referring to those profits that Rabbi Shmuel said that you could invest the Moisar Shiur Alishka, and the Moisar Nesachim is this 4th sa. Rabbi Yochanan Pasar Masnita, Rabbi Yochanan has a different explanation. He says Moisar HaPeiros, you know what Moisar HaPeiros is? Zu sa revius. That is this 4th sa. Is actually called not Moisar, it's not called Moisar Nesachim, which was a machlekes according to Rabbi Akiva, you buy klei sharos with it, and according to Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim, it's kayetz hamizbech. No, this fourth saw is actually Moisar Peres, which Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah said, what do you do with it? Kayetz hamizbech. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim, they ignored this whole Moisar Peres, and the Mishnah actually said that Zeh v'zeh lo hayu moedim b'Peres. They didn't agree with it. We're going to have an issue with that. What's there not to agree with? According to Rabbi, we understand that Moisar Peres is the profits that only Rabbi Shmuel himself allowed you to invest the Moisar Shiur Elishka. Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Shmuel, you're not allowed to invest the money of Hekdesh. So it makes sense. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim, didn't hold of Moisar Peres. But now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that Moisar Shiur, the Moisar Peres is the Sar of Vias, then why is Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim not holding? What's there not to hold of that? Okay, we'll get to that soon. But Rabbi Yochanan, he was the one that said that Moisar Peres is the Sar of Vias. What's the Moisar Nesachim is lebirutzin, is when they would buy, when they would dedicate and bring things to Hekdesh. If they promised to bring a certain measure, they would bring it heaped high. This extra heaped high is called birutzin. It was extra because the letter of the law says a flat share. If you said you're going to bring a certain measure, a flat measure, that's what you committed yourself. But the halacha is that you have to bring it piled high. This extra bit that Hekdesh would gain, that's called Moisar Nesachim, according to Rabbi Yochanan. And that was a machlekes. What would Hekdesh do with it? Rabbi Akiva says they would use it to buy klei sharis, and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim said you would use it for the kayetz hamizbech. Asks the Gemara, "V'lesli Rabbi Chia bar Yosef leberutzim." Rabbi Chia said that Moisar Peres is the profits of the Moisar Shiur Elishka. Moisar Nesachim is the fourth saw. Well, what's Rabbi Chia doing with this birutzim? He also agrees that you give extra for the Hekdesh. What's he doing with it? Rabbi Chizkiya says, "Ma de nofa l'sar vias nofa lebirutzim." You're right. The Rabbi Chia holds that the same halacha that applies to Sar Vias, namely that it has the status of Moisar Nesachim, the same applies to these birutzim. That's also considered Moisar Nesachim, and they're also, according to Rabbi Akiva, that means there's no machlekes. He agrees with Rabbi Yochanan on that point. Both agree that the birutzim is considered Moisar Nesachim. Continues the Gemara. Al daite de Rabbi Chia bar Yosef nicha. According to Rabbi Chia bar Yosef, we can understand that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim didn't hold of Moisar Peres, because they say ein mistakrim b'shel hekdesh, af lo b'shel aniyim. It says explicitly in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Shmuel, "You're not allowed to invest the money of hekdesh." So Rabbi Shmuel says you can invest it, and the profits are called Moisar Peres. Rabbi Akiva says, "I don't agree with it. You're not allowed to do it." Lefikach zeh v'zeh lo hayu moedim b'Peres. Both didn't agree. However, al daite de Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yochanan, who said that Moisar Peres was this fourth saw, kasha. Everybody agrees that if you commit yourself to a seller, and when you committed yourself, then this seller could buy 4 saw. When you actually came to the Beis Hamikdash to bring the seller, it could only buy 3 saw. Everybody agrees. There's no discussion. Everyone agrees you have to bring that 4th saw. Well, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that 4th saw is called Moisar Peres. Why is Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim not agreeing with that? V'ataninon, we learned explicitly that Omdu Megimel, that if a seller now can only buy 3 saw, Yisapek Midalit, you have to actually give the 4th saw. V'taninon, and nonetheless we learned in the Mishnah, Zeh v'zeh, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kenim, lo hayu moedim b'Peres. They didn't agree to the concept of Moisar Peres. What's there not to agree? They agree you have to bring the 4th saw. So why don't, what are you arguing with Rabbi Shmuel? Rabbi Shmuel, according to Rabbi Yochanan's understanding, Rabbi Shmuel says that the 4th saw is used for the kayetz hamizbech. You, Rabbi Akiva, you don't agree with it. Well, you agree that he has to bring the 4th saw. What's he going to do with it? According to Rabbi Chia, it's called Moisar Nesachim. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's not called Moisar Nesachim. Rabbi Yochanan says explicitly that Saravias is called Moisar HaPeiros. So why is it only Rabbi Shmuel? Why is Rabbi Akiva not agreeing with it? Answers the Gemara that of course they agreed with it. But when it says in the Mishnah they didn't agree to Rabbi Shmuel, to what Rabbi Shmuel did with it. They argued with Rabbi Shmuel. You, Rabbi Shmuel, said that Moisar HaPeiros, which is this Saravias according to Rabbi Yochanan, is going to be used for Kayetz HaMizbeach. We both don't agree with it. But we both, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chaninus Ganakenim, agree that Klei Shoris, you use this Saravias to buy Klei Shoris. Says the Gemara, Ad Kedoin, so far we know that Birutze Tzibur, we take it for granted that when Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan both explained that Moisa Nesachim include, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's only this Birutzim, this extra heap of whatever was donated to the Beis Hamikdash. According to Rabbi Chia, it was also Saravias, also Birutzim, but both agree that Birutzim is considered Moisar Nesachim, and what did Rabbi Akiva do with it? They would buy Klei Shoris. Now we take for granted that when they spoke about Birutzim, it was also of the Tzibur, when something was donated to the Tzibur, and also when it was something which was donated by the Yochid. The question is, V'lo nimtzu Klei Shoris boin mishel Yochid? But we have an issue. If somebody is going to come and give a private donation to the Beis Hamikdash, it's going to have birutzi, then this extra bit is a private donation. And what are they going to do with it? Says Rabbi Akiva, Moisa Nesachim is used for Klei Shoris. But we already said previously, Klei Shoris have to be bought only and exclusively from the Tzibur. So how can you use birutzim of a Yachid to buy Klei Shoris? Says the Gemara, no. You remember what we learned previously. We already learned, this mother who made the big day kuna for her son, even though it's a private donation, it's kshera, it's kosher, we rely on her that she's going to give it over entirely to the tzibur. So too here, the birutze of the yachid will be entirely given over for the use of the tzibur, and therefore they could buy klei sharos with it. Says the Gemara, Ad Kedoin, so far we know that birutze lach, that when donating liquids, then we understand that the heap, the extra piled over of the liquids, which are actually going to spill over, that we understand that is kodesh, and we assume that when it says in the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Akiva, you use it for klei sharos, according to Chaninus Ganakenim, for kayetz hamizbeach, we take it for granted it's talking about the liquids that were heaped over. Ad Kedoin birutze lach, v'afilu birutze yovish. But what is the same halacha going to apply with solids, that when you fill up a kli, a utensil with solids, then what was heaped doesn't first go into the kli and then come out. Going into a kli shores, it makes it kodesh, and therefore even what's left over is kodesh. When it comes to solids, what's heaped on top never went into the kli, so it's chol. What do we say there? Do we say there also that what's heaped over is called moisar nesachim and was used either for klei sharos or for kayetz hamizbeach? Kahid taninon tamon, and now I'm going to read this with the Vilna Gaon's girsa, that explicitly in a Tosefta it says the birutze lach kodesh, the heap of the liquids which actually goes into the kli and then spills out over the kli is kodesh. Birutze yovish chulin. However, the heap of a solid is not kodesh. V'lama birutze lach kodesh. Why is the heaping of the extra of the liquids, why is it kodesh? Midas halach nimshami bifnim, because it went into the kli sharos and then came out. Since it's been inside the kli, it becomes kodesh. Lama birutze lachil. Why is in these birutze this extra heap on top of the kli? Why, if it's solid, is it chil and not kodesh? Midas yavish lo nimsha bein mibifnim bein mibachutz. However, says the Tosefta, kol birutze midis halolu, but irrespective of whether it's lach or if it's yavish, im yesh zevach echod yakrivu imoy, zevach acher, if you've got another korban that you can actually use this extra for that korban, then yakrivu imoy. Ve'im lonu, and if they waited overnight, and we know that anything that was niskadish b'klei sharos is nifsal belina. If it waits overnight, it's possible. Nifsal belina. Ve'im lav, and if it didn't wait overnight, yimkaru, you should sell it l'kayetz hamizbeach. This is the pin of Rabbi Chaninus Ganakenim that we saw in the Mishnah, that this moisar nesachim, which is this birutzin, is used for for the Kayetz HaMizbeach. So you see here that even the solid, even though it's choil, it's used for Kayetz HaMizbeach. And that's the end of this Mishnah. In the next Shiur, we're going to continue the next Mishnah.